My name is Nancy, and I am 31 years old. I work today as a trauma therapist in Boston, but 7 years ago, on the night of my 25th birthday, my life changed in a way I will never forget. It happened just past midnight when I thought the day had already ended and I had settled into what was supposed to be an ordinary quiet evening. Instead, it became the night that nearly cost me my life. I was asleep when the pounding began. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but the noise grew louder, shaking the door in its frame. When I checked my phone, the screen glowed back at me. 12:17 a.m. I was disoriented, still half asleep, until I heard a voice on the other side of the door that froze my blood. It was Frank, my stepfather. His words were slurred with alcohol, but the rage in his tone was unmistakable. "Open this door, Nancy. I know you're in there." My heart began racing so fast it felt like it was going to tear through my chest. I peered through the peephole and saw him, his face red with fury, his body leaning against the door as if he was ready to break it down. Behind him was my mother, her eyes wide and filled with terror. She stood frozen, saying nothing, her body trembling like a shadow caught in headlights. I tried to steady my voice as I called through the door. "You need to leave. It's after midnight. If you don't go, I'm calling the police." I clutched my phone in one hand, desperately texting Eric, my boyfriend at the time, with the other. My fingers shook so badly that it took me 3 tries just to type a few words. Frank's tone shifted from fake cheer to fury in seconds. "We came to wish you happy birthday. Don't be rude to your parents." His words twisted the truth into a grotesque mask of family. I knew better. I begged him to go, but instead of leaving, something inside him snapped. He roared, his fists slamming against the woo. Before that night, before Frank ever entered our lives, my childhood looked very different. It wasn't perfect, but it was filled with warmth, love, and small traditions that held our world together. The story really begins when I was 8 years old, the year everything shifted. Up until then, I had both of my parents. My dad was gentle, patient, and had a laugh that filled our small suburban home like music. He was the one who tucked me into bed at night and read me stories about explorers and scientists who discovered new worlds. My mom, Diane, balanced his quiet steadiness with her energy and care. Together, they made me feel safe. I didn't know it at the time, but those years were a gift. Then came the diagnosis: lung cancer. It moved fast, too fast for us to even understand what was happening. One day, he was strong enough to carry me on his shoulders, and months later, he was in a hospital bed, thin and coughing, his strength disappearing like water slipping through fingers. By the time I turned 8, he was gone. Just like that, my anchor was ripped away. I remember the silence in our house afterward. It wasn't just the absence of my father's laugh. It was the way my mother moved through the rooms, carrying the weight of grief while trying to be strong for me. She was suddenly both parents in one, working long hours, managing bills, cooking dinners, and still finding a way to sit beside me at night when the sadness wouldn't let me sleep. Those years, as painful as they were, drew us together in a way that felt unbreakable. My mom became my safe place. We made rituals that helped us heal. Friday nights were movie nights. We would curl up on the couch with popcorn and watch old comedies until we laughed so hard it hurt. On weekends, we baked cookies together, the kitchen filling with sugar and warmth. And no matter how exhausted she was from her 2 jobs, she never me. The first time he came over for dinner, he made an impression. He arrived holding flowers for Mom, and to my surprise, a book for me about astronomy. A subject I had been fascinated with ever since my father bought me a small telescope. Frank smiled warmly, asked me about the constellations, and even joked about us planning a trip to a planetarium together. I was hesitant at first, still protective of the bond I had with my mom, but I couldn't deny that he seemed thoughtful. For a while, things looked promising. He included me in outings to museums and the zoo, never pushing too hard, but showing up consistently enough to seem genuine. He was attentive to Mom, complimenting her, helping around the house, and making her feel seen again. After years of watching her sacrifice everything for me, I felt like she deserved someone who could give her the stability she had been missing. Within 6 months, he proposed. Mom accepted, her face glowing in a way I hadn't seen since before my father died. The wedding was small, quiet, exactly how she wanted it. Soon after, we moved into Frank's spacious colonial house in an upscale neighborhood. It was a dramatic change from our modest home. I had my own room with new furniture, a computer, and a bookshelf stocked with novels. It all felt like stepping into someone else's life, a life filled with security and opportunity. In the beginning, I tried to be grateful. I told myself Frank was giving my mom the fresh start she deserved. And to be fair, for the first few months, things were calm. He was generous, attentive, and protective in a way that almost seemed comforting. I remember thinking maybe, just maybe, this was going to work. But then the changes started, subtle at first, easy to dismiss. He insisted on handling the finances, convincing Mom to close her personal bank account and merge everything with his. He said it was more effy. It began with money. Mom no longer had her own bank account. Every paycheck she earned went directly into Frank's control, and he made sure she knew that nothing could be spent without his approval. He dressed it up as family unity, telling her, "We don't need separate accounts. We're one now." But in reality, it meant he held all the power. Even the smallest purchases, a pair of shoes, a birthday gift, were scrutinized. Mom, who had once managed a household on her own, now asked permission like a child. The isolation was just as insidious. Frank had opinions about everyone in Mom's life, and his disapproval spread like poison. One by one, her friends drifted away until her once full calendar became empty. The laughter that used to echo through our house during visits vanished. When the phone rang, Mom would glance nervously at Frank before answering, her voice clipped, short, never lingering too long in conversation. I noticed her world shrinking, and with it, her spirit. For me, the transformation was heartbreaking. The woman who once twirled around the kitchen in red lipstick and a bright sundress now wore muted tones Frank deemed appropriate. She no longer sang while she cooked or hummed along to the radio. She moved quietly, carefully, as though she was always bracing for impact. The first time Frank's temper exploded in front of me, I was only 14. Mom had come home with a sundress she bought for a work event. It wasn't expensive, but Frank reacted like it was an act of betrayal. He screamed, his face red with rage, and hurled his plate of spaghetti against the wall. I can still see the sauce dripping down, bright red against our cream-colored wallpaper, looking disturbingly like blood. Mom apologized over and over, returned the dress the next day, and never dared to shop on her own again. That was the moment I realized that the control wasn't just about me. By the time I reached high school, fear had quietly woven itself into every part of my life. It wasn't always loud or violent. It was the constant tension of waiting for Frank's next outburst. The way silence in our house felt heavier than noise. I learned to read the atmosphere like a weather report, predicting storms before they hit, adjusting my behavior to avoid becoming a target. I buried myself in school as a way to cope. Clubs, sports, study groups, anything that kept me out of the house. I spent hours at the library, telling myself it was to get ahead academically, but in truth it was sanctuary. At friends' houses, I laughed and acted like everything was normal, but the moment I stepped back into our home, the air changed. My shoulders tensed, my words became careful, and I retreated behind a closed bedroom door. Frank never told me I couldn't participate in activities. In fact, I think he liked me being gone. As long as I kept my grades up and didn't challenge him, I was invisible to him. That invisibility became a twisted form of safety. But my relationship with Mom, once the strongest part of my life, crumbled. I resented her silence. I resented the way she looked at Frank for approval before making decisions. I resented that she didn't defend me when he belittled me or dismissed me. Whenever I tried to confront her, she shut me down with the same line. "You don't understand. Frank provides for us. He's a good man deep down." It felt like I had lost her long before she physically stood by and watched him hurt me. The turning point for me came in my junior year. I walked into her room one evening and found her at the mirror, carefully dabbing concealer over a bruise on her cheek. She claimed she had tripped into a door in the dark, but she couldn't look me in the eyes as she said it. My heart sank because I didn't need her to admit it. I already knew. Frank H. The day my acceptance letter from Boston University arrived, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in years. That single envelope represented freedom, my ticket out of the suffocating atmosphere of Frank's house, my chance to start over in a world where his control couldn't reach me. When I opened it, Mom stood beside me. For a flicker of a moment, I saw pride in her eyes. She hugged me tightly and whispered, "I always knew you'd do something amazing." But underneath the pride was something else, fear. Fear of what my absence might mean for her. Fear of being left alone with Frank. Fear of losing the one anchor she still had. The night before I left, she came into my room after Frank had gone to bed. She sat down on the edge of my bed like she used to when I was little and whispered, "Promise me you'll build a good life. Don't let what's happening here stop you from becoming who you're meant to be." There was so much sadness in her voice that I blurted out, "Come with me. We'll figure it out together. You don't have to stay here." She shook her head slowly. "This is my life now, Nancy, but it doesn't have to be yours." The next morning, Frank drove us to Boston. He played the role of supportive stepfather flawlessly, carrying boxes into my dorm and introducing himself to my roommate's parents as though nothing was wrong. When it was time to leave, Mom hugged me tightly, holding on for longer than usual, and whispered, "I love you." Frank gave me an awkward pat on the shoulder and a check for emergencies. I never cashed it. That first semester felt like stepping out of a dark cave and into sunlight. Suddenly, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. I made friends who knew nothing about my past, joined study groups, and even tried out for the debate team. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to walk on eggshells. I could laugh loudly, stay out LA, come tea, and speak freely without the constant fear of Frank's shadow. I chose psychology as my major, driven by questions that had haunted me for years. Why did my mom stay with Frank? Why did Frank need to control and hurt others? Could I have done something differently? I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that my professors noticed. One of them, Professor Sarah Levine, became both a mentor and a friend. She specialized in trauma and domestic violence, and when I finally opened up about my background, she didn't offer pity, she offered tools. She connected me with support groups, recommended books, and encouraged me to consider therapy. For the first time, I began to understand that what had happened in my family wasn't my fault and that healing was possible. Meanwhile, Mom and I spoke only occasionally. Our phone calls were brief, careful, and always carried out when Frank wasn't home. She never admitted to what was happening, but I could hear it in her voice, the heaviness, the rehearsed lines about everything being fine. I visited for holidays during freshman year, but the atmosphere was unbearable. By sophomore year, I stayed in Boston most breaks, making excuses about work or study obligations. College became more than just education. It was a safe harbor, a place where I could finally imagine a future not defined by fear. Yet even as I thrived, a part of me carried the weight of guilt. I was free, but Mom was still trapped. That tension between survival and helplessness would follow me for years until the night everything collapsed and Frank's violence finally reached me in the one place I thought I was safe. By my junior year of college, I had built a life that finally felt like my own. I had friends, a career path I was passionate about, and for the most part, peace. But even as I found freedom, I could never shake the feeling of being tethered to Meito, a mother's world, one where Frank still ruled with control and violence. It showed in small ways at first. During one of our video calls, I noticed a faint yellow bruise around her eye. When I asked about it, she brushed it off with a shaky smile, insisting she had tripped on the stairs while carrying laundry. Her story might have sounded believable if not for the way her eyes darted off camera, as though Frank were standing just outside the frame. I tried to press gently. "Mom, you know you can tell me anything, right? If something's happening, I can help." But she deflected, quickly changing the subject to my classes, my friends, my new projects. It was her way of keeping the conversation safe, and I let her, even though every instinct in me screamed that she was hiding the truth. By then, I had befriended Catherine, a colleague at the community mental health center where I worked part-time. Catherine specialized in domestic violence cases, and without revealing my mother's situation directly, I started asking her questions. What makes victims stay? What's the most dangerous time for them? She told me something that stuck with me. The moment they try to leave is often the most dangerous. That's when abusers feel their control slipping and they escalate. I began quietly preparing for the day Mom might be ready. I researched domestic violence shelters in her area, saved hotline numbers, even compiled legal resources about restraining orders. I put them all into a password-protected document on my laptop. I didn't know if she'd ever use them, but having them made me feel a little less powerless. Then, 3 months before my 25th birthday, the call came that shook me. I was eating dinner with Eric, my boyfriend, when my phone rang. On the other end, my mother's voice trembled. She was whispering. "He found the brochure," she said. My stomach dropped. "What brochure?" "The one you mailed me, for the Women's Center." Her voice cracked. "Eddie. He went through my purse. He knows." I could hear her trying to stifle sobs, speaking quickly while she had the chance. "He says I'm ungrateful, that I'm planning to leave him after everything he's done." He broke my phone. "I'm using the neighbor's landline while he's out." I felt my chest tighten with panic. "Mom, listen to me. Pack a small bag, only the essentials. I'll call you an Uber to the bus station. You can come stay with me. We'll figure out everything else later." "I can't just leave," she protested weakly. "The house, my job." What will people think? None of that matters if you're not safe. Mom, I'm safe, I insisted. Please, Mom, I'm afraid of what he'll do. There was a long pause, so heavy I could hear her breathing. Finally, she whispered, maybe you're right. Let me think about it. I'll call you back tomorrow when he's at work. Eric had been listening to my side of the conversation, his eyes full of concern. Do you think she's in immediate danger? Should we call the police? I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. Frank is careful. He's never left evidence that would get him arrested. If we call and nothing happens, it could make things worse. That night, I barely slept. I kept my phone on my chest, waiting for her call. When it finally came the next day, my hope crumbled. Her voice was unnaturally bright. Everything's fine now, she said. Frank and I talked. He was just worried about me being influenced. We're starting marriage counseling. Every word was a lie, rehearsed. I could picture Frank standing beside her, monitoring what she said. I tried to push, but she cut me off. Oh, Frank wants to say hello. Then his voice came through the line, smooth and controlled. Nancy, how nice to hear you've been keeping in touch with your mother. I hope you're not filling her head with nonsense about our marriage. I swallowed hard. I just want her to be safe, and happy. She is, he replied firmly, a subtle threat hiding behind the calmness. Perhaps you should focus on your own life instead of interfering in ours. Family is sacred. Remember that. The call ended abruptly. My hands were shaking as I put the phone down. For weeks after, Mom didn't answer when I called. The few texts I got were lifeless updates about gardening or errands, clearly written with him standing over her shoulder. As my 25th birthday approached, dread settled in my stomach like a weight I couldn't shake. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong. I couldn't prove it, but every instinct told me that danger was coming, and I was right. My 25th birthday should have been a milestone, a celebration of how far I'd come from the frightened teenager who once tiptoed through life in Frank's house. Instead, it became the night everything I'd feared and everything I thought I'd escaped came crashing back into my world. The day itself had been simple. My coworkers surprised me with cupcakes at lunch and a small gift card. Eric had promised me a belated celebration the following evening since he had a client emergency that night. I didn't mind. I was used to keeping things small. That evening, I treated myself to Thai takeout, poured a glass of wine, and curled up on the couch with a novel. My apartment, my own little sanctuary, felt warm, safe, and entirely mine. By 11 o'clock, I had changed into pajamas and was drifting toward sleep. That's when the pounding began. At first, I thought it was a neighbor's guest knocking on the wrong door, but then I heard the voice, slurred, furious, unmistakable. Frank. Open this door, Nancy. I know you're in there. My stomach dropped. My entire body went cold as if someone had poured ice water through my veins. I crept toward the door, looked through the peephole, and there he was, red-faced, swaying, his fist slamming against the wood, and just behind him, barely visible in the hallway light, stood my mother. Her eyes were wide, terrified, but her body was rigid, paralyzed. Go away, I shouted through the door, trying to keep my voice steady while my hands shook uncontrollably. It's after midnight. If you don't leave, I'll call the police. He banged harder. We came to wish you happy birthday. Don't be rude to your parents. His tone was mocking, grotesque, twisting the idea of family into something sinister. I clutched my phone in one hand, frantically texting Eric with the other. Frank is here, drunk. Mom's with him. I'm scared. Then it happened. He snapped. You ungrateful little... His words dissolved into rage as his body slammed against the door. The wood splintered around the lock. One more kick and the door gave way, flying open with a crash that echoed through the apartment. He stumbled inside, his eyes blazing. I stumbled backward, raising my phone. I'm calling 911! But before I could hit dial, he lunged. His hand tangled in my hair, yanking me so hard I screamed. His fist connected with my cheek, a burst of stars exploding in my vision. Frank, stop! My mother's voice cried from the doorway, thin and panicked. Please, you're hurting her. But she didn't move. She just stood there, tears spilling, hands covering her mouth. I clawed at Frank's face, kicking at his legs, but he was bigger, stronger, fueled by alcohol and fury. He slammed me into the wall, the back of my head cracking against the plaster. My vision blurred, my body screamed with pain. This is what happens when you try to destroy a family, he hissed into my ear, his breath hot with whiskey. Then he wrenched my arm behind my back and twisted upward. The sound, pop, was sickening. My shoulder dislocated, pain so white-hot it nearly knocked me unconscious. I screamed, a sound so primal it hardly felt human. I looked at my mother through tears, pleading, "Mom, help me!" But she didn't move. She froze, locked in terror. Frank shoved me again, his fist slamming into my ribs. Something cracked. Another blow to my temple sent me crashing to the floor. Through swollen eyes, I spotted my phone a few feet away, its screen still lit. With every ounce of strength left in me, I reached out, pressing the emergency SOS button I had programmed. 3 quick taps sent my location to emergency services. Frank's boot connected with my ribs again. I curled into a ball, gasping for air, tasting blood. My body trembled violently as darkness closed in. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the sound of my mother's sobbing. She was crying out words I couldn't hear, her body still frozen in place. And faint in the distance, like a lifeline, were the wails of sirens growing closer. That night, Frank shattered not just my shoulder and ribs, but every illusion of distance I thought I had put between myself and his violence. My sanctuary had been invaded, my body was broken, my mother's silence had been louder than any scream. And as I slipped into unconsciousness, I didn't know whether I would ever wake up again. When I opened my eyes, the world was blindingly white. At first, I didn't know where I was, the sterile smell, the rhythmic beeping, the dull ache in every part of my body. Then I turned my head slightly and saw Eric sitting beside me, his hand wrapped tightly around mine. His head was bowed, his face drawn with exhaustion, as though he hadn't left my side all night. "Eric," I rasped. The sound of my own voice startled me. It was hoarse, broken. His head snapped up, relief flooding his features. "Nancy," he whispered, leaning closer. "Thank God, you're awake, you're safe." He pressed the call button, and within seconds, a nurse bustled in, followed by a doctor in a white coat. They explained my injuries in calm, measured tones, a dislocated right shoulder that had already been reduced. 2 fractured ribs, severe bruising across my face and torso, and a mild concussion. "You're lucky the police arrived when they did," the doctor said. Lucky. The word felt strange. I didn't feel lucky. I felt broken. Memories flooded back in jagged fragments, Frank's fists, my mother frozen in the doorway, the sickening pop of my shoulder. My chest tightened, and for a moment I thought I might suffocate under the weight of it. Eric squeezed my hand. "Frank's in custody," he said. "Somso," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "The police arrested him at the scene. Your mom, she's here too. In the waiting room, she's been here all night, but she was afraid to come in." Before I could process that, a woman with kind eyes entered the room. She introduced herself as Officer Rivera. Notebook in hand, she explained she needed my statement while the memories were still fresh. My voice trembled as I recounted everything, from the pounding on my door to pressing the SOS button to the final blows before I lost consciousness. Eric never let go of my hand. When I finished, Officer Rivera nodded firmly. "We have him charged with breaking and entering, assault, and battery. The partial emergency call recorded pieces of the attack, and the evidence is clear. The only question now is whether you want to press charges." "Yes," I said without hesitation. My voice shook, but my resolve didn't. "I want him prosecuted to the fullest extent possible." When the officer left, silence settled into the room until there was a soft knock at the door. My mother stepped inside. I barely recognized her. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from crying, her hands trembling at her sides. She looked smaller than I remembered, fragile in a way that made my heart ache. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly, as though she were the intruder. Eric gave me a questioning glance. I nodded. He stood, kissed my forehead, and whispered, "I'll get some coffee, take your time." Then he left us alone. Mom approached slowly, her eyes fixed on my face, on the bruises, the swelling, the sling cradling my arm. She covered her mouth with one hand, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Nancy, I'm so sorry." For a moment, anger flared in me. I wanted to turn away, to tell her it was too late, that she should have acted years ago. But then I saw something I had never fully let myself acknowledge, the haunted look in her eyes, the tremor in her body, the way she flinched at every sound in the hallway. She wasn't just a bystander, she was a survivor, too. "How long?" I asked softly. "How long has he been hurting you?" Her shoulders collapsed under the weight of the truth. "Since the first year we were married. At first it was just grabbing, shoving, then slaps. He always apologized after, promised it would never happen again. By the time it got worse, I was trapped. He controlled all the money, isolated me from my friends. He told me I was worthless, that no one would ever believe me. And he said if I ever left, he would kill you, that he'd find you no matter where you went. The words sliced through me. She hadn't stayed out of love. She had stayed out of fear. For me. I thought if I did everything he wanted, if I kept him calm, he'd leave you alone, she whispered. But in the end, I failed anyway. Tears blurred my vision. For years, I had resented her silence, believing she chose Frank over me. Now I saw the twisted logic of abuse, the way fear rewrites love, the way survival looks like surrender. He belongs in prison, Mom, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She nodded slowly. I know. I already told the police I'll testify. I'm done being afraid. Seeing him hurt you, it finally broke something in me. I can't stay silent anymore. In that hospital room, surrounded by the weight of pain and betrayal, something shifted between us. We were no longer just mother and daughter. We were two survivors, bound not just by trauma, but by the fragile hope of rebuilding what Frank had tried so hard to destroy. 3 months after the attack, I stood outside the Suffolk County Courthouse with my hand clenched tightly in Eric's. My right shoulder was still stiff, my ribs still tender, but I no longer needed the sling. The courthouse loomed with its granite columns and cold marble floors designed to intimidate. And in a way, it worked. My stomach churned with nerves, but beneath it all was determination. I had survived. Now it was time to face him. Jessica, the lawyer Catherine had connected us with, met us in the lobby. Her navy suit and bulging briefcase projected calm authority. Are you ready? She asked, studying my expression. As ready as I'll ever be, I said, my voice steady even as my heart hammered. My mother joined us moments later. She had been staying in a domestic violence shelter, and already the change in her was striking. She stood taller, spoke more clearly, and made eye contact with a confidence I hadn't seen in years. She wasn't the same broken woman I'd found in my hospital room. She was reclaiming herself. Inside the courtroom, the silence was suffocating. Frank sat at the defense table, dressed in an expensive suit, his silver hair neatly combed. If you didn't know better, you'd think he was a CEO, not a man accused of violent assault. Beside him sat his lawyer, Thomas Wilson, a sharp-tongued attorney known for aggressive tactics. When Frank's eyes met mine, contempt flashed across his face before he composed himself. For years, I had been terrified of that look. But this time, I didn't look away. I held his gaze until he turned back to whisper to his lawyer. That small act, refusing to flinch, felt like my first victory. The trial began with opening statement. Netza Maria Delgado, the prosecutor, outlined the case in stark detail. The break-in, the assault, my injuries, the years of controlling behavior that built to this moment. Then Wilson spoke, painting Frank as a concerned stepfather who had simply tried to reason with a hysterical young woman who attacked him first. His story twisted reality into a grotesque lie, but Jessica leaned over and whispered, "Let the evidence speak." When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand with deliberate calm. I swore to tell the truth, then looked out at the jury, 12 strangers who now held my story in their hands. For nearly 2 hours, I answered Maria's questions. I described my childhood after Frank entered our lives, the controlling behavior, the way he isolated my mother. I recounted the night of my 25th birthday in excruciating detail, the pounding on the door, the splintering wood, the blows, the dislocation of my shoulder, the desperate SOS call. Maria's final question was simple. At any point that night, did you attack or threaten Mr. Sullivan? No, I said firmly. I never even opened the door. I asked him to leave and told him I would call the police if he didn't. Then came Wilson's cross-examination. He tried to provoke me, painting me as a manipulative daughter who had been trying for years to drive a wedge between my mother and Frank. You sent materials about leaving one's spouse to your mother's home, didn't you? He demanded. I sent information about domestic violence resources because I feared for her safety, I replied, keeping my voice calm. He pressed harder, suggesting I was jealous of Frank's authority, vindictive, determined to ruin their marriage. Each question was a trap, but I had prepared. I took a breath before every answer, stuck to facts, and refused to be baited into anger. My mother's testimony followed. At first, her voice shook as she described 12 years of escalating abuse. But as she spoke, her words grew stronger. She detailed the financial control, the isolation, the threats. Then she recounted. Ted, the night he forced her into the car and dragged her to my apartment. He said he was going to teach Nancy a lesson for turning me against him, she testified. When he started hitting her, I froze. It was like watching a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Wilson tried to discredit her, suggesting she was unstable or seeking financial gain from divorce. But Mom answered with quiet strength, describing how Frank had stripped her of all financial independence, how she had nothing in her name. The jury leaned in, visibly affected. Then came the medical evidence, photographs of my bruised face, my shoulder in a sling, the doctor's report detailing the fractured ribs and concussion. The ER physician testified about the significant force required to cause such injuries. Several jurors winced at the photos, their eyes flicking toward Frank with disgust. Officer Rivera testified about the scene, the broken door, the blood on the wall, my unconscious body, Frank raging as they restrained him. They played the partial emergency call in court. The room fell silent as my screams echoed through the speakers, Frank's threats captured forever. Throughout it all, Frank sat stone-faced, but I felt his stare on me. For years, that stare had paralyzed me. Now, it fueled me. On the final day, Maria delivered a closing statement that laid bare the truth. Frank had systematically abused and controlled his family for over a decade, and on that October night, his violence nearly cost me my life. When the jury deliberated, the minutes stretched like hours. But in just 2 hours, they returned. The forewoman stood. On the charge of breaking and entering, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of assault and battery with intent to cause grievous bodily harm, we find the defendant guilty. Relief washed over me so intensely, my knees nearly buckled. Mom gripped my hand, tears streaming down. Own her face. 2 weeks later, at sentencing, the judge's words echoed through the courtroom. Mr. Sullivan, you used your position of trust to terrorize your family for years.
This court sentences you to 15 years in state prison. As they led him away, his mask of control finally cracked, his face twisted with rage. For the first time in over a decade, I felt the weight of his shadow lift. I could stand straight, I could breathe. For the first time since I was 12 years old, Frank no longer had power over us. After the trial, life didn't magically return to normal. Healing wasn't like flipping a switch, it was slow, messy, and full of setbacks, but for the first time in years, the path forward was ours to shape, not Frank's. When I was discharged from the hospital, Eric insisted I stay with him while my apartment was repaired and fitted with stronger locks. Mom stayed too, sleeping in the spare room while I recovered in Eric's bed, and he took the couch despite my protests. In those first fragile weeks, our little trio became a kind of safe harbor. Eric was patient and steady, making sure I ate, helping with medication, and sitting quietly when nightmares woke me in the middle of the night. Mom hovered, guilt heavy on her face, but also determination. She attended therapy sessions at a center Catherine had recommended, finally talking openly about the abuse she had endured for over a decade. At first, our conversations were difficult. Old resentments lingered. I still felt anger that she hadn't protected me, that she had let Frank control us for so long. She carried guilt for freezing during the attack and for years of silence, but slowly, through therapy and late-night talks, we began to rebuild. There were tears, sometimes shouting, but also laughter creeping back into moments we never thought we'd reclaim. We weren't just mother and daughter anymore. We were survivors, learning together what it meant to live outside Frank's shadow. Physically, my recovery was grueling. Months of physical therapy restored most of the movement in my shoulder, though certain angles remained painful. My ribs healed, but even years later, I still felt a dull ache when the weather turned cold. The concussion left me with headaches that flared under stress. The scars weren't all visible, but they were constant reminders of that night. Emotionally, the journey was even harder. The nightmares were the worst, vivid recreations of the attack that left me waking in a sweat, heart pounding as though it were happening all over again. Therapy became a lifeline. My counselor helped me process the trauma, guiding me to face the rage I carried, not to bury it, but to transform it. She reminded me that survival isn't weakness, that even in freezing, even in breaking, there is strength in enduring. Mom's transformation was equally profound. After living with me for 6 months, she moved into her own apartment nearby. She began rediscovering who she was before Frank. She started gardening again, joined a book club, and even pulled out her old favorite red lipstick. Small acts, maybe, but each one was a rebellion against the years of control that had erased her. She found a part-time job at a bookstore and made new friends, learning to live on her own terms. Meanwhile, I poured myself into my work. I finished graduate school with the help of my mentor, Professor Levine, and secured funding to open a small center dedicated to supporting survivors of domestic violence. We called it the Breakthrough Center, and what began as a single office offering counseling sessions grew into a community hub. We provided therapy, legal resources, housing assistance, and career workshops. Former clients came back as peer mentors, creating a cycle of support and hope. I realized something crucial in that process. Holding on to hatred for Frank kept me tied to him. It gave him space in my life he no longer deserved. True freedom came not from forgetting or forgiving what he had done, but from releasing the corrosive grip of rage. By letting go of the need to carry hatred, I made space for something else: healing, growth, and compassion. Eric stood by me through it all. He understood the way trauma rewires trust and intimacy. He never rushed me, never pushed. He was simply steady, a quiet reminder that love could be safe. Years later, when he slipped a ring onto my finger, I said yes, not because I needed saving, but because I had already saved myself, and I wanted to share the life I was rebuilding with someone who honored that. Mom sat in the front row at my first public talk as director of the Breakthrough Center. She smiled proudly as I told a room full of survivors. Trauma changes you permanently. There is no going back to who you were before. But with time, support, and courage, you can build something new from the pieces that remain. Our scars, hers, mine, didn't vanish. They became part of us, but they no longer defined us. Frank had taken years of peace, but he failed to take what mattered most: our ability to heal, to rebuild, and to choose a life beyond fear. 2 years after the trial, I stood in front of a small audience at the Boston Women's Shelter, sharing my story publicly for the first time. My voice was stronger than I ever thought it could be. My scars, both visible and hidden, were still there, but I carried them differently now. They were no longer marks of shame or fear. They were proof of survival. My name is Nancy, I began. And today I want to talk about the journey from victim to survivor to thriver. I told them about the night my stepfather broke into my home, about the hospital bed, the courtroom, and the long climb back toward healing. I told them about my mother's transformation, about how she went from silence to finally reclaiming her voice. I told them about the Breakthrough Center, where survivors could find not just resources, but also community. And then I told them the truth that had taken me years to understand. The hardest lesson I learned was that you cannot save. Be someone who isn't ready to be saved, but you can leave the light on for them, you can hold the door open, you can create a space where they know they'll be welcome when they're ready. That's what my mother and I finally found: a light, a door, a space to begin again. Mom sat in the front row that day, her smile radiant, her posture no longer weighed down by fear. She had rebuilt her own life, wearing her red lipstick again, tending her garden, working part-time at the bookstore she loved. She was living proof that it's never too late to reclaim yourself. I looked out at the women in the room, some with visible bruises, others carrying wounds no one could see, and I wanted them to know the same thing. Trauma changes you, I said, but it does not destroy you. You are not broken beyond repair. Healing is possible, freedom is possible, and you are never alone. The applause that followed wasn't just for me, it was for every woman in that room who had survived another day, for every person who had chosen hope over despair. That is why I share this story. Not to relive the pain, but to remind others that silence does not have to be the end of your story. Speaking out, reaching for help, and holding on to resilience can transform even the darkest chapters into the beginning of something new. So, if my story has touched you, I ask you to do 3 things. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment about your own experience or the resources that have helped you. Subscribe and stay connected so that these stories can reach others who may feel alone in their struggle. Because no matter what you've endured, no matter how many times you've been broken down, healing is always possible. You are stronger than you know, and you are never, ever alone.